She was driving herself to work in the morning, and it all unraveled for them. No driver. No protection officer sat in the front seat. No royal motorcade. Just a woman, in a car, doing her own mascara in the rearview mirror before pulling into the car park. And somewhere across London, in an office that smells of old money and older grudges, a team of palace lawyers had just made the single most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of the British monarchy. They looked at Sophie, Countess of Edinburgh. They looked at her background, secretary's daughter, PR woman, commoner, and they decided she was the easiest target in the building. 25 years of quiet preparation was about to come crashing down on their heads, and they never saw it coming. Because that is what happens when you spend a quarter of a century underestimating the most strategically intelligent woman in the most powerful family on Earth. If this story is new to you, or if you've only ever seen Sophie in the background of official photographs, standing 3 steps behind the people the cameras actually want, then I need you to stay with me. Because what I'm about to walk you through is not a story about tiaras and jewelry disputes. It is a story about institutional arrogance, long game strategy, and the woman who spent 2.5 decades building a legal fortress so quietly that the people inside it never even noticed the walls going up until the doors locked from the outside. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, please hit subscribe right now. This channel is dedicated to forensic royal commentary, the unfiltered, documented, evidence-based analysis of what is actually happening inside the most scrutinized family on Earth. Not the press release version, not the courtier spin, the real version. Hit like if you think the mainstream coverage misses the actual story. Every single time. Right, let's get into it. Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones was born on the 20th of January 1965 in Oxford. She grew up in Brenchley, a village in rural Kent. Her mother was a secretary, her father was a sales director. She attended West Kent College, where she trained as a secretary herself. And then, and this is the detail the palace should have paid considerably more attention to when she pivoted into public relations, represented firms in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in Australia. And in 1996, she stopped working for other people and opened her own agency. Her own, on her own terms, with her own clients, her own reputation, and her own income. 3 years before she ever became royal. She first met Prince Edward in 1987, 12 years before they married. She was working at Capital Radio. He was dating her friend. She was 22 years old and already building something. She did not circle back into his orbit until years later. And when she did, she arrived not as someone hoping to be absorbed into an institution, but as someone who already understood, from the inside, how institutions like that one actually function. This is the foundational detail that changes everything that follows. Sophie's entire professional life had been spent understanding how powerful organizations project image, manage reputation, and handle crises. She did not walk into Buckingham Palace wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the machinery. She walked in as someone who had spent a decade studying machinery exactly like that one, and she immediately recognized every single lever. She also refused, from the very beginning, to become dependent on the institution's infrastructure. She drives herself to engagements. She handles her own hair and makeup. That is not a charming anecdote. That is a deliberate strategic choice made by a woman who understood from day one that the moment you allow an institution to own your logistics, you have handed it the most powerful tool it has to control you. 2 years into the marriage, the test came, and it was brutal. In 2001, Sophie was caught in one of the most devastating tabloid stings of the early millennium. A News of the World reporter, posing as a fake sheikh, secretly recorded her making candid, indiscreet comments about members of the royal family and senior political figures. The recording was damaging. The optics were catastrophic. And every historical precedent suggested exactly one outcome. The palace would distance itself, the press would be fed the appropriate briefings, and Sophie would spend the next decade paying penance in increasingly minor royal engagements until she quietly faded from relevance. That is what happened to Diana's closest allies when the relationship became inconvenient. That is what happened to Sarah Ferguson. The institution's mechanism for dealing with liabilities is always the same. You isolate them. You withdraw support. You make them feel their position is conditional, until the conditions become impossible to meet. What actually happened was entirely different. Edward stood beside her without hesitation, publicly and without equivocation. Whatever conversation happened behind closed doors at Bagshot Park, the external face was unified and unshakable. But more importantly than that, Sophie herself did not wait to be told what to do. She identified the structural vulnerability in her own position, made the call herself, closed her PR agency, stepped back from commercial work entirely, and committed fully to royal duties. Before the palace could use any of it as leverage against her, she removed the conflict on her own timeline. She did not ask permission. She managed the situation with the precision of a professional who had spent her entire career managing situations exactly like this one. The institution expected compliance born of desperation. What they got was a demonstration of exactly how uncontrollable Sophie actually was. And this is where the story really begins, she went quiet and started building. In royal politics, the single most valuable currency is proximity to the monarch. And Sophie, the commoner from Kent, the PR professional, the outsider, quietly became the person Queen Elizabeth II trusted most in the family. Not Charles, not Anne, not the senior courtiers who had served for decades. Sophie. Queen Elizabeth was said to view Sophie as a second daughter. And I want you to understand how that relationship was actually built. Because it was not built through performance or flattery or any of the things you might assume. It was built through three things: consistency, discretion, and genuine care. Sophie showed up. Every engagement, every unglamorous duty, every low-profile official function that nobody in the press was covering, she was there. Every time. Without complaint. Without demanding recognition. She was also in a family that was hemorrhaging confidential information to tabloids at a rate that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. Completely watertight. Not a single private family matter was ever traced back to Sophie. In a leaking institution, the person who never leaks anything becomes, over time, the most trusted person in the building. And she genuinely liked the Queen, genuinely shared her interests, horses, the countryside, the kind of quiet conversation that is not about position or power, but about actual human beings finding each other tolerable company. Elizabeth, who had spent 70 years watching the institution perform loyalty and then fail the actual test of it, recognized in Sophie something she had not seen often enough. The consistency was real. And Elizabeth made sure to document it. Sophie also became the person who quietly helps guide Kate Middleton through what it actually meant to join this world, because she had done it herself and remembered what nobody had told her. She was present for Kate in an unofficial capacity, the kind of steady, experienced, genuinely kind presence that costs the institution nothing and provides the sort of institutional knowledge that no briefing document can convey. Now, this is the moment where I need you to really pay attention, because this is where the story pivots from a biography into something else entirely. During the period when King Charles was undergoing cancer treatment, and when the Princess of Wales was recovering from her own cancer diagnosis, the two most publicly visible senior working royals were essentially absent from frontline duties for extended periods. The monarchy in 2025 was navigating what may have been the most operationally fragile period it had faced in decades. The question of who would actually carry the weight of the institution during that period is not an academic one. Someone had to. And when you look at the numbers, the answer is uncomfortable for the people who had been quietly trying to diminish Sophie for years. Prince Edward carried out 313 official duties in 2025. The Duchess of Edinburgh carried 235. Together, they were the engine of a working monarchy during its most vulnerable recent period. But the nature of Sophie's engagements is the part that should make every person who dismissed her feel genuinely embarrassed. In April 2024, Sophie visited Ukraine. She was the first British royal to visit the country since the Russian invasion began. She sat across a table from President Volodymyr Zelensky. She met with survivors of war-related sexual violence and torture. She met with children who had been returned to Ukraine after being abducted by Russian forces. She did not do this with a camera crew angling for flattering angles. She did it because she had spent years building a genuine, internationally recognized body of work around conflict-related sexual violence work that has earned her praise from Hillary Clinton, who has called her a trailblazer. In October 2024, she became the first member of the British royal family ever to visit Chad, meeting with refugees who had fled the Sudanese civil war and had experienced sexual violence. This is the woman the palace chose to target in a jewelry audit. The first royal into a war zone. The first royal into refugee camps in Chad. The woman whose humanitarian work was drawing international recognition at the highest diplomatic levels was simultaneously being told she couldn't keep her wedding tiara. Let me explain what the Anthemion Tiara actually represents, because without understanding this, the audit looks like a bureaucratic dispute. And it is not a bureaucratic dispute. Sophie lost her mother at a young age. She grew up without that anchor. When she married into the royal family in 1999, Queen Elizabeth became something genuinely important to her. Not a sovereign to be managed or a symbol to be photographed beside, but a mother figure in the quiet, daily, practical sense. A woman who checked in, who noticed, who stayed. In 1999, Elizabeth commissioned the Anthemion Tiara as Sophie's personal wedding gift, a piece made specifically for her, not loaned, not allocated, made for her and given to her as a documented personal gift from the woman who had chosen to welcome her as a daughter. When Sophie wore it, she was wearing proof that she belonged, that she was valued, that the most important woman in the family had looked at her and said, "You are ours." And here is the detail that makes what followed so deliberately calculated. Sophie had been consistently passed over for access to the grand state tiaras that other senior royal women wore to formal occasions. The Cambridge Lovers' Knot, the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, the pieces that signal full, permanent, unquestioned, institutional belonging. Sophie's access was limited at best. The Anthemion Tiara was her only crown, the only piece that said she was wholly, permanently part of this family. Calling it in under a legal audit was not housekeeping. It was a message. You were never fully one of us, and we have the paperwork to prove it. Sophie understood the message precisely. So did Edward. So did Princess Anne. And the response that came back was not the one the auditors were expecting. Here is where the miscalculation becomes truly spectacular. The palace's entire strategy for managing difficult or inconvenient members relies on a single foundational assumption. The target fears losing their position more than the institution fears the consequences of attacking them. That assumption is what gives the institution its power. Strip it away, and the whole mechanism falls apart. It worked with Diana for a while. It worked with Sarah Ferguson. It worked with Harry, who ultimately chose to leave rather than remain and fight. It has never once worked with someone who had already made themselves genuinely unassailable. And Sophie, quietly, patiently, over 25 years, had made herself exactly that. Edward produced a signed 1999 deed of gift from Queen Elizabeth herself, explicitly classifying the Anthemion Tiara as Sophie's private, personal property. Signed, dated, filed. The palace's own matriarch had already settled the question they were pretending to re-examine. But Edward's legal team did not stop there. Because Edward had personally designed a matching black and white pearl set to complement the tiara when it was commissioned as Sophie's wedding gift. As the original creative designer of that accompanying set, he holds intellectual property rights over it. His legal team's argument was this: The tiara and the pearl set form a single, indivisible artistic work. You cannot separate the Victorian honeysuckle stones from the overall artistic creation without violating the copyright of the man who designed it. Think carefully about what this argument actually does. It transforms Sophie from someone defending a possession into someone at the center of a legally recognized work of art, created specifically for her, documented as such, and protected by copyright law. The tiara is no longer simply an object that might or might not be classified as crown property. It is one half of a copyrighted artistic work, commissioned as an explicit act of love, and separating it from its creative context would constitute a violation of the intellectual property rights of its designer. The auditors arrived expecting to process a jewelry reclamation. They left, staring at an intellectual property lawsuit that had no precedent in royal institutional history, and no clear legal mechanism for the Crown to win. They had brought a checklist. Sophie's husband brought copyright law. And the institution that had assumed Sophie would comply because she came from outside had forgotten, catastrophically, that she understood institutions better than anyone inside it. Because here is the thing about the machinery that Sophie had spent her entire career studying. She knew, from the first day she walked through those doors, how it worked. She knew how institutions protect themselves. She knew what documentation matters. She knew what relationships need to be built, and what agreements need to be formalized, and what legal instruments need to be filed. And she spent 25 years, while everyone assumed she was just grateful to be there, filing every single piece of paper. Her humanitarian work was internationally recognized before the palace ever publicly endorsed it. Her relationship with Queen Elizabeth was documented in signed legal instruments, not dependent on the goodwill of whoever currently sat on the throne. Her home was protected by a 150-year commercial contract that the Crown itself could not break. Her only tiara was shielded by both a royal deed of gift and intellectual property law. And her closest ally was Princess Anne, the one person in the family whose public credibility and institutional standing made her, functionally, untouchable. The institution that had spent decades treating Sophie as a secondary figure, restricting her access to state jewels, assuming she would accept whatever she was given and be grateful for it, had inadvertently allowed her to construct a position so legally and reputationally fortified that attacking her was an act of institutional self-harm. Every time they pushed, they were the ones who bled. Former BBC royal correspondent Jenny Bond said of Sophie that she had been quietly working away, tackling difficult issues, for so many years, always happy to operate under the radar and without a fuss. Under the radar, without a fuss. While building something that turned out to be completely unassailable. On the evening of the 25th of March 2026, the master of the jewel house confirmed in writing, Sophie retains full, exclusive, private control of the Anthemion Tiara. The audit was over. The institution had blinked first. And the woman they had assumed would be the easiest to move had not moved at all. But I want you to understand why this matters beyond one piece of jewelry and one institutional dispute. Because Sophie's case changed something structural. She established a template. Every woman who marries into the British royal family from this moment forward now has a documented precedent. You can protect yourself from the institution using commercial law, intellectual property rights, and documented royal authorizations if you plan carefully enough and early enough. Sophie didn't just win her own fight. She built a roadmap for everyone who comes after her. She also dismantled, permanently, the assumption that commoners are the most disposable members of the family. The received wisdom of the deeply embedded, never questioned institutional belief was always that those without royal blood are the most vulnerable. They have the least claim. They are easiest to return to obscurity. Sophie's case demonstrates the precise opposite. An outsider who builds an independent reputation, independent legal protections, and an independent relationship with the public is actually harder to remove than someone who depends entirely on the institution's favor. Because when the institution withdraws its favor from an insider, the insider has nothing left. When it withdraws favor from Sophie, Sophie still has everything she built herself. Every institution has a version of this story. The person they bring in from the outside, the one without the legacy, without the bloodline, without the inherited position, the one they assume will be grateful enough, desperate enough, uncertain enough to accept whatever they are given and never push back. Sophie was supposed to be that person. The secretary's daughter from Kent. The PR woman who married the Queen's youngest son. The commoner who should have spent 3 decades being managed and contained and quietly reminded of how fortunate she was to be there at all. Instead, she became the most immovable person in the building. Not because she fought loudly, not because she leaked information to the press, not because she made threats or caused scenes or gave interviews designed to embarrass the institution, but because she quietly, patiently, over the course of 25 years, did the work, built the relationships, filed the paperwork, earned the reputation, and made herself genuinely, irreplaceably valuable. The Anthemion Tiara is still on a shelf at Bagshot Park. Sophie's name is still on the deed. And the institution that tried to take it is the one that looks diminished today. The real self-sabotage in this story, the catastrophic generational miscalculation, is this. A monarchy built on the idea that outsiders are vulnerabilities, that commoners who marry must be managed and contained, and if necessary, discarded. Created in Sophie the living proof that the opposite is true. The outsider who earns her position is more resilient than the insider who inherited theirs. Because what you build yourself, no one can take from you. I want to hear from you in the comments. Which part of this story landed hardest for you? Because I think Sophie's is the story people will be returning to for a very long time. Not because of the diamonds, but because of the 2.5 decades of quiet, undetected, perfectly executed preparation that made a single legal audit collapse in on itself like a house made of assumptions. If this analysis gave you something, share it with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one, the stories that happen behind the walls that the official version never tells you about. Because in this family, right now, the official version is nowhere near the whole story, and we are just getting started.